So about 10 years ago, I was reading a book called A People's History of the World by Chris Harman. I've actually reviewed it on this YouTube channel, and if you've seen my review of that book, you know that I gave it a mostly negative review. But it wasn't all bad. There were some interesting things that I did learn from that book, and one of the interesting things that I learned from that book was the existence of popular movements before the French Revolution. So before I read that book, I had the idea that, there was the democracies in ancient Greece and Republican Rome, and then there was a long stretch where there were no popular movements or democratic movements until the American Revolution, or more significantly, the French Revolution. The French Revolution being more significant because it was in the heart of Europe. And this was the view of history that I had gotten from school. In fact, I remember I had one teacher who would emphasize this quite explicitly. The idea that before the French Revolution, there was just no feelings of democracy or equality among the lower classes during these periods. Chris Harman documents a number of popular movements before the French Revolution, and one of them that I found very interesting, he didn't talk a lot about it, but it sounded very interesting from the brief description he gave of it, was a group called the Levelers, which were from England. Now, this was a group that came about during the English Civil War. The English Civil War was, I think, in the 1640s. It was between the king and Parliament, but there was a group of soldiers and normal people who formed this group called the Levelers, where they wanted all social distinctions to be leveled. They wanted everyone to be on equal footing. They were not proto-socialist. They didn't believe in redistributing property, but they did want to make everyone politically equal before the law. So they were considered quite radical Republicans in their day. Now, I said they were not proto-socialist, but there was another group, which is probably equally interesting, that was around during the same period, which were actually kind of agrarian communists, and those are known as the Diggers. Both of these groups sounded quite interesting, and it was something I had never heard about in my history education before. Now, I'm an American, so I have some level of ignorance about British history, but yeah, this is something that doesn't get a lot of press in the American history textbooks. And it was something that sounded quite interesting to me, so I went to Wikipedia to read more about the Leveler movement. I was living in Japan at the time, so I did not have access to like a decent library where I could go and find actual books about the Levelers. And, even if I had access to a decent library, I'm a bit lowbrow. I tend to go to the Wikipedia page first anyways. The Wikipedia page mentioned that there was a dramatization of the Leveler movement called The Devil's Whore. At least if memory serves, they did. This was about 10 years ago. I've gone back to the Wikipedia page for the Levelers, and I don't see the link there now. So either maybe I'm misremembering, or maybe they've updated it in the past 10 years. But from that, I found out about this British miniseries called The Devil's Whore. Came out in 2008. It was for Channel 4. I don't know what Channel 4 is, some British channel. Produced for Channel 4 in Britain. It consists of 4 episodes, each 1 hour, so 4 hours in total. And this sounded interesting to me, so I said to myself, I wonder if this is on YouTube somewhere. And sure enough, it was. And I watched the whole thing. And Yes, I'm going to give this a mixed review. There are a number of things that were not great about that, and I'll talk about all the things that are not great about this miniseries. But I'm going to recommend this on the whole to a certain type of person. So this is historical fiction. If you're a big fan of historical fiction like I am, then quite often you're willing to forgive a number of you're willing to forgive a certain amount of bad fiction or bad writing if the history that it introduces you to is interesting enough. This is a classic case of that. Yeah, I'll get into it. There's a number of flaws with this miniseries, but this still served as a very good introduction to, if not the Leveler movement as a whole, at least some of the more prominent names associated with the Leveler movement. And this was my introduction to John Lilburn, Thomas Rainsborough, and Edward Saxby. All three of them were prominent levelers, and again, this miniseries has its flaws, but all three of them were portrayed in a very intriguing way. They were portrayed as characters that you wanted to know more about. So the next time I was in an English-speaking country and I had access to a decent library, I did track down books on Thomas Rainsborough and John Lilburn. And I'll talk about those books in a separate video someday. The one on Thomas Rainsborough I didn't end up finishing because it was written in a somewhat dry academic style, and I just gave up on it. The one on John Lilburn I actually did finish. So that's how I'm going to justify this series. It's not great. I mean, there are some interesting things about it, but it's not great. But if you watch this series, it will give you a decent enough introduction to some of the main people behind the Leveler movement, and then you can use that to go into the library and find decent books yourself. And admittedly, not everyone is going to want to go that route. I guess I'm recommending this to people who are of a similar temperament to myself. And this is how I find I get into history or historical periods, is I usually start off with a fictional representation, either a movie or a novel, a historical novel, or a movie set in a historical period. And once that sparks my interest, once that lights up my imagination, then I'll go and read the real history behind it. And that's typically how I learn my history. I mean, I'm a history geek, but I'm somewhat of a lowbrow history geek. If you are of a similar temperament to me, then I think this is not a bad way to go about it. Watch this miniseries. It'll give you a decent introduction. There are, of course, historical inaccuracies in this. There are tons of historical inaccuracies in the miniseries, but there are also things that did really happen in it. And after you watch the miniseries, then you can do your own research on the facts behind it. And I think this is important, especially if you're interested in the history of popular movements, or if you're interested in leftist history. Because this is the Leveler movement, and figures like John Lilburn and Thomas Rainsborough pop up not infrequently in leftist discourse. So for example, the year after I watched this miniseries, I remember I was in Melbourne, Australia at a meeting with the Socialist Party, and we were at the pub drinking after one of the meetings, and somebody was talking about the Leveler movement. And he was talking about John Lilburn and Thomas Rainsborough, and I believe he even got one of the names wrong, and I was able to jump in and correct him, which is, you know, those moments us history geeks live for. We memorize all these obscure facts just so we can jump in and correct other people. I'm being somewhat facetious. But I guess the point being, if you're at all interested in leftist discourse or leftist history or socialist movements, then this is worth knowing about. Now, again, the Levelers were not socialists. They're more Jeffersonian. But they were considered quite radical for their time, and so they're celebrated by people who are interested in radical history. Right. So, yeah, this miniseries. This miniseries is about. Okay. Yes, it's a little bit strange the way they do this. It's about the central character is a woman who it's a love story. Actually, it's several different love stories. And if you're not a big fan of love stories, and I'm not, then you're like, oh, geez, romance stories. Oh no. And yeah, it does get really cheesy. It gets so cheesy. But they integrate the history of the Levelers into this love story. And in fact, two of the prominent Levelers, Thomas Rainsborough and Edward Saxby, become infatuated with this woman, and they both fall in love with her. Both end up getting married with her at different points in this 4-hour series. And now this is where the fiction part of this historical fiction comes in. Because in reality, this woman did not exist, and Thomas Rainsborough and Edward Saxby obviously did not fall in love with her because she didn't exist. Excuse me, I'm going to shift my position here. I'm sitting on the floor, which is not comfortable. But I think, on the one hand, that's what makes something like this really cheesy. But on the other hand, that's kind of the genius about this, because the English Civil War is notoriously complicated to try and make any sort of logical sense out of. Meaning, like, the cast of characters who circled through there's just a huge cast of characters. So, like, at the beginning of the English Civil War, the people who are leading the parliamentarian side of it are, they're completely out of power or gone or dead by the time you get to the end of the English Civil War. So if you want to make some sort of coherent drama where you have main characters and you want to keep these main characters and give each main character a story arc, you've got to simplify things, and it helps to create a fictional character that can tie it all together. So by having this woman be the fictional character, and by inventing these romantic affairs that she had with the different Levelers, that gives you a nice story arc to tie all these different people together. According to Wikipedia, as of this recording, they said that this miniseries has received criticism for leaving out a lot of people from the English Civil War, like John Pym or Henry Ireton or Thomas Fairfax. And I read that criticism and I thought, who writes these things? The way Wikipedia said it was anonymous. Who is criticizing this miniseries for leaving out all those different names? You couldn't possibly include all the names in the English Civil War in a 4-hour drama. So they have to consolidate characters, they have to cut out characters, and the historical inaccuracies do result as a result of this. But it's they've made it into a coherent story that's worth watching, and then after you watch this, then you can go and do your research. Now, again, I'm speaking as an American, somebody who at the time I first watched this 10 years ago knew very little to nothing about the English Civil War. I rewatched it just today, actually, just over the past couple days. And, speaking of which, actually, at the time I'm recording this, it's right during the COVID-19 time. where everybody is locked down in their houses and bored out of their mind, and everybody is looking for distractions and recommendations. I recommend this. Well, I've already said that there's some things that are not great about it, but if you're interested in history, I recommend this, and it's on YouTube. There's a version that has Spanish subtitles, and there's part 1, which is 2 hours, and part 2, which is 2 hours, so they put the episodes together. And it's, the quality isn't, though it's watchable. It's totally watchable. So I'll leave the link in the description down below. I know everybody is kind of going out of their minds with self-isolation during this time, and by all means, watch it. And in fact, maybe watch it before you listen to the rest of this review, because I'm going to ramble on and spoil some things. So yeah, I'll leave the link down below, or just search in YouTube for The Devil's Whore. What was I talking about? I completely lost my train of thought. Oh, right. So I rewatched that copy on YouTube. And in the years since, I've actually have picked up some more knowledge about the English Civil War. So I was able to both pinpoint stuff that was historically accurate, or, some famous quotes or famous events from history. I was able to say, right, that's a real quote. I recognize that. Which I didn't have the first time I watched that. But the first time I watched it, I think I found it all the much more interesting. Because you have the story of the Leveler movement, which is fascinating in and of itself. But you also have the story of Oliver Cromwell and the English Civil War. And King Charles and how he gets beheaded. And all that stuff is also included in this 4-hour drama. There's a lot of history they work through here. And it's interesting. And they, in order to create more character arcs, I think they do show some of the Levelers being closer to Oliver Cromwell than they actually were in real history. Although, Oliver Cromwell really was a friend of John Lilburne. And I think that scene when Oliver Cromwell in the Parliament is calling for John Lilburne to be free was actually historical. Sorry, I don't want to get in. I'm going down a tangent, aren't I? I don't want to get into talking about all the things that were historical and weren't historical about this miniseries, because I could talk all day about it. And also there's a danger that I might get something wrong, because I'm not an expert. I'm just a hobbyist when it comes to history. But point being, they compress a lot of stuff, they consolidate a lot of characters. But I think the broad story is more accurate than not. Well, I don't know. It depends how you judge these things. There's a lot of stuff that is accurate. There's a lot of stuff that is not accurate. How generous or how generous or how harsh you want to be in your evaluation, I guess is going to depend on how much. Is going to depend on how much you're willing to forgive the stuff that's not accurate. Excuse me, I don't know why I'm so tongue-tied today. I guess I'm just feeling a little bit tired. The acting in this miniseries is pretty good, I think. Actually, it's more than pretty good. I think the acting is pretty impressive. The guy that they get to do Oliver Cromwell is really impressive. The guy who's doing Thomas Rainsborough is actually Michael Fassbender, and I believe this was before he became really famous. And he does a really good job on it. The guy they get to do John Lilburne is really amazing. He's perfect as like the charismatic guy up on the soapbox, giving speeches and just kind of getting the crowd really riled up. I mean, you can see from watching this dramatization, even though it is only a dramatization, you can easily imagine how a figure like this could have become so popular and so charismatic back at the time. The guy who does King Charles is, what's his name? Peter Capaldi. who is most famous for being Doctor Who at one point. Now, I was never a Doctor Who fan, so I'm not really a big fan of this actor per se, but he does an excellent job as King Charles. You know, just the right measure of arrogance, and the way King Charles is constantly overplaying his hand in any given situation comes through very nicely in this miniseries, and you can see how this character is just dripping over arrogance, and yeah, I think they do a really good job of it, and even though there's some inaccuracies in here, because I think all these performances are so memorable, it helped to sear these story arcs into my brain a lot more than I think if I had just been reading them out of a book. And then, like I said, after I saw this, then I was able to track down books later to get more of the real history behind it. The writing, though, yeah, this is one of those TV melodramas where characters are prone to give a lot of speeches, especially the main character, and the writing is a bit cringe. You're just and it's so overly melodramatic. Now, the fact that it's so overly melodramatic is kind of a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. I mean, it's bad because you're watching this and you're like, oh, this is so over the top. This is so cringeworthy. On the other hand, I mean, again, it was about 10 years ago when I saw this for the first time. I think this is one of the reasons it's stuck in my mind so well the past 10 years, is because you remember it because it's so over the top. So yeah, I mean, good or bad, the writing can be really cringe, and the soundtrack. This is one of those classic things where, like, they try and milk the pathos out of some of these moments by having the violins playing softly, and it's yeah, it just adds to the cheesiness and the cringe factor of it. But again, there are some moments that are really well done in here. And there, I think there are some things that they dramatize quite nicely. The leveler movement is dramatized quite nicely. The debacle with Cromwell's debacle in Ireland gets dramatized quite nicely. It does border on being a little bit over the top, and they do bring in that cheesy soundtrack to it. But you remember it. There are some quite powerful scenes, and it does a very good job of showing very visually why that Ireland campaign was such a atrocity. And again, this is something that had stuck in my mind over the years as I've gone on to read some more serious histories. Nothing too serious, but as I've dabbled in trying to figure out the actual history behind it, I think one of the reasons I remember that Cromwell in Ireland was a big deal was because of this miniseries. So, at the risk of repeating myself, I think to sum up, my main points would be this. It's incredibly cheesy. Some of the writing and dialogue is over the top and cringeworthy, and yet the acting is really good, and I think it serves as a decent introduction to some important historical figures and some important historical events that are often overlooked and which deserve to be remembered. So I would recommend it on those merits, and also it's entertaining. I mean, even when it gets cringeworthy and overly melodramatic, it's still entertaining. So, I know everybody is bored out of their minds these days with the self-isolation. I'll leave the link in the description down below to the YouTube videos of this miniseries, or you can track them down whichever way you like. It's worth a watch. I'd recommend it.